Welcome to the Religion and Popular Culture podcast, the podcast that discusses religion, popular culture, and everything in between. My name's Aled Thomas, and I am joined as ever by my friend and colleague Vivian and Aled.
Hello.
Hi Vivian, how are you?
I'm okay.
I'm glad to hear it. And it's quite an exciting one this week. Because we are going to be discussing an episode of Star Trek The Next Generation, specifically Who Watches the Watchers, Season 3, Episode 4. And while I'm the one hosting this week's podcast because I'm the resident Trekkie, it was Vivian's idea to discuss this episode because she is currently... Would you say it's your first proper watch through of Next Gen?
Oh, yeah, it definitely is. Like my mom was a Trekkie, but we never actually watched a lot of Star Trek.
Yeah.
Growing up, so this is my first proper exploration through the world of Star Trek.
Well, Vivian told me that she thoroughly enjoyed this episode and wanted to discuss it, and being the Star Trek fanboy that I am, I said, yes, let's do it, because it's a particularly interesting episode for us as academics specialising in the study of religions, because it has two distinct layers that make it quite interesting. On the one hand is its depiction of religion, but on the other hand is its depiction of the study of religion, which you don't often see happening in popular culture.
Well, it's not the most exciting of things, let's be honest.
It's not. I mean, I guess stuff like the Da Vinci Code try to make it a bit more exciting, even though it essentially created a discipline that doesn't exist. It was still pretty much a depiction of study religion.
You don't consider yourself a symbologist?
I do not consider myself a symbologist, no. In fact, I once put the word symbology into a draft of my PhD thesis, to which my supervisor highlighted and said, "Don't use this word, you're not Dan Brown." So, yes, I'm not a symbologist, no. But anyway, this is an episode of Star Trek The Next Generation. So, Next Generation is... I mean, I feel there's very little point in going through the history of Star Trek. It's such a popular show and is so deeply embedded in popular culture that everybody tends to know of it one way or another. But Next Generation was the reboot series, almost the sequel to the original series that took place 100 years or around 100 years after Captain Kirk's legendary 5-year mission of the original series. And this particular episode aired in 1989, which is a good year because that's also the year I came out. And it's... And it starts off a fairly normal Star Trek affair. The Enterprise arrives at a planet called Mintakan 3, and there is a Federation outpost that they are checking up on. And this outpost is studying a quasi-Vulcan-esque community who are not aware that the Federation are there. And that's because of something that's not... which... Yes, I guess raises ethical questions.
We'll get into that.
We'll get into that in a moment. But it comes back to the idea of the Prime Directive, which is a term that gets thrown around a lot in the Star Trek universe and is broken every other episode despite how important it is. And I love the Prime Directive because I often make a joke about it as an academic who's done fieldwork and ethnography, and how we almost have our own Prime Directive as well. But it's not quite as crystal cut as the Star Trek universe makes it out to be. So the Prime Directive of the Star Trek universe is that the Federation cannot interfere with the natural development of a society/planet. So the Federation doesn't make itself visible to a planet until that planet has developed the ability to travel into space. Once they can travel into space, they are obviously going to meet alien life, and therefore the Federation then deem it acceptable to make themselves known. And that's what's known as first contact in the Star Trek universe. So the, the amusing thing about the Prime Directive is that they tend to not get involved with planetary matters that do not concern the Federation. But then they often do. And the problem I have with the Prime Directive is that just by being somewhere, you are affecting the outcome of these events. Particularly if we think about this from a study of religion's perspective, is your presence as an academic is always going to affect your fieldwork participants and the way they behave and the way they speak to you and so forth. Anyway, that's the Prime Directive thing out of the way. Shock horror, an accident happens out the outpost where the Federation have to come in. The Enterprise comes to help some people out, and two members of the Indigenous Society spot Dr. Crusher in particular, and one of them, I believe, is injured. I'm right in saying. Because it's been a little while since I've seen this episode.
Yeah, so he basically, like, because the outpost is kind of hidden from, like, a holographic thing. And so they see it, and one of the guys goes to crawl up to go see what it is. But obviously there's some kind of, I don't know, magic, science, force field.
Yes.
And so he touches it, and it shocks him. And so he falls down, and Dr. Crusher, being a good doctor, rushes to his side to make sure that he is okay. Which obviously just further complicates matters.
Yes, because she almost has her own Prime Directive in that she will offer healthcare to anyone who needs it. And she deems it necessary to beam him aboard the Enterprise. So, so for context, 5 minutes ago, this guy thought that his race was the only race in the universe, and now he's on board the Enterprise, and he believes that he has been healed by the Picard. The Picard, of course, is referring to Captain Picard, whom he sees when he awakens, and they're all speaking about Picard. Sorry, it's really funny because I think the thing that really gets me with this episode is that it's essentially a comedy of errors.
Well, yes.
Everything they try to do to rectify the situation just makes it worse. So they send him back down to the planet, and he tells his society that he was resurrected by a deity known as the Picard, and he insists that they have to worship the Picard, and so on. So this is obviously a violation of the Prime Directive, because it looks like this entire culture is now going to be skewed towards worshipping the Picard. So there's a number of issues, I think, that comes up here, and the first one that really comes to mind with me is how the Federation views a projection of a society, in that the Enterprise doesn't seem to just find it a problem that they believe that Picard is a god, but the fact that they believe in a god in general is seen as a backward step.
Yes. So my poor husband was watching this with me, and he had to keep dealing with me going, actually... Which is, I try not to do too often, but I do probably too much when we're watching shows that do anything regarding religion. But yeah, so it kind of harkens to a particular viewpoint of anthropology, specifically, I think evolutionary anthropology, which there's still some branches of, but it's kind of relatively died out at this point. But yeah, they say basically this kind of viewpoint saw things as that cultural evolution happens in a similar way to biological evolution. So we evolved from, monkeys in that very classic image. And then once we hit the upright man, then we start evolving. You could kind of imagine it almost like as a vertical axis. And from there, we progress from animism to polytheism to monotheism and ultimately to atheism. This is the viewpoint of how these work. But this is not accurate to how people have developed. There have been societies where it started as, say, monotheist and then switched to polytheist, or they started from polytheist and then switched to animist. There's all sorts of different ways that things have developed very differently to this. And also the idea was that we could therefore go to a polytheistic society and they would be the lower cultural evolutionary standpoint to where we currently are as the white colonial atheistic force
Yes.
that is coming down. So obviously there was a lot of racism that was embedded into the system as well, because clearly they would be going to not white people and studying them and seeing them as essentially the infantile version of the white society. So obviously there's quite a lot of problematic things under there, and this is actually echoed in that episode. So at one point, it's the strangest way of rectifying this is that Picard beams aboard one of the head women who are in charge of this indigenous society and shows her around the Enterprise in this move where me and my husband were sitting there going, why? What does that help? What is that doing?
Yes, it was just it was just violating the Prime Directive even more.
Just to such a but anyway, during that bit he explains to her that the reason why they are there to study is because it helps them understand their own past. By looking backwards at their society, they can get a better grasp of how their society also developed, which is this understanding of evolutionary
Yes.
anthropological thought, which also discounts a lot of the very specific contexts to religion and how religion and the rest of the elements of society all interact with each other. At the beginning of, this kind of new step of this podcast, we talked about how messy religion is and how you can't really separate it from things like popular culture, but also from things like politics and economics and all of these other elements that really impact our understanding, and to kind of see things as, it's a completely different planet, which means that their environment is different, which means that their understandings and their contexts are going to be vastly different everywhere that they are. So, anyway, that was...
Yes, and they are presented as being on this trajectory to atheism.
Yes.
That the natural conclusion for this Vulcan-esque planet is that they will become they will become rational atheists. It's quite interesting actually, because on the subject of them being Vulcan-esque, the Vulcans are incredibly religious in Star Trek. Maybe not in terms of their of worship of the deity, but the rituals involved in Vulcan society, and even the ethics of logic is incredibly religious. So I don't feel that the Vulcans can be categorized as this group that have moved beyond religion at all. Sorry, that's just a little.
Well, I mean,
note.
we see that in Next Gen. There's obviously Worf, who's a Klingon, is kind of their token alien, essentially,
Yeah.
that they have on there. And there's so many of the Klingon rituals that we see him undergoing. But yet there's no mention of deities. But there's a certain point of me kind of going, yeah, but that's still.
Yes,
that's
yeah,
still
absolutely.
something.
Yeah, absolutely. And the way the Klingons are written is very rich for that sort of religious characteristics, let's say. But when this poor chap who was been fried by some force field and healed on the Enterprise with this incredible technology that he cannot fathom, is sent back to the planet, he starts disseminating the truth of the Picard, and the way that he is interpreted by his fellow society is quite interesting. So, for the most part, he is dismissed as being crazy. But after a while, people do start to listen to him somewhat. And continuing the comedy of errors, they send Councillor Troy and Riker down to the planet disguised, because this was always going to end well, um, disguised as citizens of this planet to essentially undermine him, I want to say.
Yeah.
To be the skeptics in the audience saying, "Oh, this is absurd," and steer him towards atheism, because it was more than steering him away from the Picard. It was steering him towards the natural point of the cultural anthropological view of society's development towards this rational atheism. Um, Star Trek's quite interesting for this in general because it is very much a humanist show. So Gene Roddenberry was openly humanist, and society is very much presented as having moved beyond traditional forms of religion. In Star Trek, sometimes they do really strange things, though, that does suggest to me that they very much haven't. Especially if part of the message of Star Trek is that there's equality of cultures and so forth. Um, but also, there's an episode of the original series where Kirk meets Apollo. I think it's Apollo from Greek mythology, who wants the crew of the Enterprise to worship him and to be his children. And Kirk says to him, "Oh, we don't need any more gods. We're quite content with the one." And I think, what? What on earth are you
What?
talking about, Kirk? Which one? But also, it really kind of undermined. I know this was early Star Trek, so the world building was being fleshed out a little bit more. But sometimes religion isn't quite as neatly packaged in the Star Trek lore as people assume it is. Um, so I don't think we need to worry about spoilers very much. This is an old episode now, isn't it?
Yeah, and I gave the warning in our last episode of saying,
Y-
you know, if you want to watch it
yes.
beforehand, please do. It is available on the UK Netflix, at least. I'm not
Yeah.
sure on the other countries' is Netflix, but
So eventually Picard beams down to the planet in a last-ditch attempt to convince this chap that he is not the Picard, or at the very least, the Picard is not a deity, that he is flesh and blood. And he, he gets shot with a crossbow, I think. Remind me,
yeah,
it's been a while.
he does. And it's one of those, and then they were like, oh, look, he's bleeding, so clearly he's human, and it changes everything. And there was this part of me that was like, have these people not heard of Jesus?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah. As if that would remove this guy's doubt after everything that he has seen. Um, in in the Enterprise and so forth. So it's an interesting episode in terms of religion and popular culture in the sense of how religion is presented, but I think the really interesting aspect of this episode is the ethics of the Prime Directive and the ethics of the Federation as researchers of religion and
yeah,
culture.
it kind of reminds me of when you start kind of going into certain groups as an anthropologist or a sociologist, and you're, you know, basically ethically we have to be incredibly open with who we are, what we're doing there. I think in my fashion episode I talked about how I was constantly kind of reminding people that I wasn't Muslim while I was there, and there was two reasons for that. One was because I felt like I needed to let them know just from that kind of personal endeavor, but also because it was based on my ethics that they need to know who I am and why I'm there, so that way anything they tell me, they know why I'm asking, or how I would use that information. Because I think that's a really important element of communication, of the things that I might tell someone just to tell someone versus, oh, this might be recorded or this might be shared with a wider audience. I might rethink things, I might second guess stuff. And some people say that that's not the way that we probably should be conducting this. This is typically non-academics telling us that maybe we should be more covert with our endeavors, and I know that Aled, you've gotten this a hell of a lot more than me because of your groups, particularly that you studied. But there's a reason why we don't do covert.
Yeah.
It's not ethical. That again, those people need to be thinking about it, but for multiple reasons. That not just because my presence there changes what they might be thinking, but also them knowing that I'm there has sometimes changed things for the positive. It means that I have been kind of catered around and shown things. When I was in a Christian Science church, I was being driven home all the time by the same couple. They felt uncomfortable with me walking home in Edinburgh by myself late at night on a Wednesday, which I appreciate. So they would drive me back to my flat. But on that drive, they would be teaching me the history of Christian Science because they knew that I was an outsider. They knew that I was not a member. And it meant that I got a lot of information about how they viewed the church in a way that I would not have received had I been hiding who I was.
Yeah.
So
Yes, yes.
there are benefits to it. It's not just negative, but the biggest thing is that they have a right to know who I am. They
Yes, of
have a
course.
right to know what it is that I'm doing there and why I'm bringing out a recorder when they're talking, why it is that I'm asking certain questions, why I'm sat in the back of the room with a tape recorder while they're doing their church service. You know, I don't need to hide it. I don't need to try to pretend that I'm doing something different because they know exactly who I am and what I'm doing there. And they can ask me questions about it. They can ask me questions about what exactly I'm asking and what my research is doing. And they can ask for copies of what I'm doing. And it becomes a dialogue rather than a lecture.
Yes, absolutely. And then it causes what quite understandably happens is your presence is always going to affect the way that people will behave around you.
Yes.
For the record, I'm not advocating a covert approach here. I'm simply looking at the the pros and cons of our approaches, because a lot of this comes down to insider-outsider dynamics, which I really enjoy because I'm really boring, and
I was about to say I hate these conversations. But...
yeah, I really enjoy insider-outsider conversations. I think because I've been very interestingly placed in my own research. So if you are doing participant observation in the study of religions, and if you know any of our listeners who have done ethnographic research themselves would know, you can be an observer and participant. You can be invited to take part in things. You can be invited to take part in a service, for example. But you are always going to have that. You are always going to have a barrier between you and the insiders because of the reason why you are there. You are ultimately there for a different purpose to everyone else, and you are also your presence will affect the way that people behave around you. Because, for example, you know they'll want their group or their organization, for example, that they're very passionate about, to be represented well in your work. So, for example, if you ask an organization if you can have a sample of people to be interviewed, you are going to be presented with the choir. You are not going to be presented with somebody who's a little bit disgruntled and jaded. So there's dynamics, and the point I'm trying to make here is the problems with the Prime Directive. Is that even if you take the Prime Directive stance of, oh, we're not getting involved, simply by being there, you're involved.
Yes.
No matter how much.
In anthropology, we practice something called reflexivity, which is where during the project you are constantly reflecting on those kinds of questions and those elements. So I can say, you know, I did have exposure to some really wonderful people who really cared about the church, but I also was presented to these people by the church, which means that, you know, you have to kind of take that. But I can think about that and then I can present that in my research and saying, look, I got given these people from the church, but they're still people who do
absolutely
believe these things. And you kind of can reflect on that. And there were times where I would have to reflect on the fact that, oh, when I was here these people reacted slightly differently because of the way that I was there, the types of questions I was asking, and the fact that I had a tape recorder in my hands. And I have to reflect on that and show that I at least acknowledge that. But that's kind of part of practicing reflexivity for anthropology, is
Yes.
to reflect on exactly those changes and to say we acknowledge that, but also I can't know what it's like when I'm not in the room.
Yeah, 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 absolutely. So it's about understanding those dynamics and acknowledging that your understanding of what's happening will inevitably be slightly different to a practitioner, for example. And then it raises the ethical question of what the Federation are doing on this particular planet, because they aren't simply being covert; they are literally invisible. They have
Yes.
they have a force field surrounding them so that the culture can't see them. So
Well,
it's
so
not
they're
simply a
covert in two different ways, right? Because they're covert at the beginning with the outpost being hidden and them like really like pretending that they're not even existing while they're there studying them. And then they're covert again when they send Troy and
yeah,
Riker down to the planet pretending that they're these people, but then that have atheistic views. And you're like, what?
yeah, yeah. There's two layers to it, and both of them are problematic. Because it's particularly when the point comes when Troy and Riker go down, they they're essentially just digging an even deeper hole for themselves. Because at this point they're trying to undo the mistakes of the beginning of the episode, but just making it worse. I think it's a really funny episode in that sense. But it raises that question, and in my own research, I've again much like what you were saying, Vivian, always been very clear with my research participants who I am and what I'm doing. And that means you do get that limited experience in a way, in that there were certain parts of buildings I've been to that I wasn't allowed in because I wasn't a true insider, so to speak. And there were certain events that I was told that, oh, if you want to come to this, you need to come here for your own benefits, not as a researcher. So that's always at play, but you always acknowledge that. And you always say, oh, okay, I'm aware that my presence caused this to happen, but what I still gathered was very important.
Yeah.
You don't go down the covert route, which and this is part of the problem that my subdiscipline in the study of new religions gets, is that there have been plenty of non-academic studies, expose pieces of new religions that have been conducted by people who've gone into religions covertly, which is, a major ethical question. But for people who are anti-new religions or anti-cults or so forth, they'll often see that as being more valid because this person has gone in and had the true experience. But they have been deeply untruthful to the people that they're working with, to say the least. And I mean, I can't even begin to explain why it's so bad without getting a little bit flustered about it. And I know I'm preaching to the choir here, really.
Okay, but I think it's important for our listeners to know about this, because I think, like you said, you hear a lot about the covert stuff in particularly journalistic takes on stuff. And I always read those with a huge grain of salt because of my knowledge of how these ethics need to be carried out and why they are important. And so I would encourage other people to read those same exposés with in the same way, because of those kinds of things, that it's essentially an act of violation. If
Yeah.
you imagine that, say, I invited Aled into my home and we are going to be chatting about Star Trek and, I don't know, everything else that's going on in my life. And then he turns around and writes a huge article about how I hate religion because of the way I talked about religion in Star Trek. And I'd be going, that's not true. And also, I thought I invited you in my home as a friend, and now I'm personally offended, and I feel like my home has been violated by someone who I don't trust. My trust in other people have been broken. We talked a bit about the cycle of alterity in the fashion episode, and surprisingly, it actually works really well in this discussion of we're talking about groups that see themselves often as the other
Yeah.
from the kind of mainstream group. And when someone comes in and breaks trust in that way, it further others them, feeling, well, that's why I can't talk to many people who are new or outside, because this is what happens. They break my trust, they hurt me, and then they further other them. So even if you firmly believe that some of these groups are dangerous, you're making it worse and more dangerous by going in covertly.
Yeah, 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 absolutely. Because you are creating binaries and
Yes.
you are creating divisions. And also, if somebody feels the need to be covert in their research, then they are clearly hiding an agenda.
Yeah.
Because why else would they be doing it? And yeah, I found it really interesting. Some of the responses my work got online amongst anti-cult groups. One person dismissed my work because I didn't adopt a covert approach. Because they said that Thomas's findings are going to be incredibly limited because he went in making it clear who he is and what he's doing. If he wants to make a true study, he should go undercover, which is, I'm sorry, an absurd position. But as you were just saying, it's incredibly important that we do stick to ethical guidelines because of the damage that can be caused in that way. And also, as you were saying, people will tell you things because they know you're trying to learn.
Yeah.
There are benefits as well. I've spoken to so many very helpful people who've given me more information than they would say if I was just coming in off the street because I was interested in Scientology, which is what my PhD research was on. But because they knew I was a researcher, they gave me materials because they thought it would help me with my work. I was given all these DVDs and so forth, and books. They were really useful, and I was given them because I was trying to learn.
Yeah, and I had a moment of necessary reflexivity. So I was during my master's, I did a bit of time in a Christian Science church where I was listening to their testimonials. So every Wednesday they have a testimonials section where everything's kind of quiet, and then occasionally someone will stand up if the mood takes them, and they'll talk about what happened to them that week and what they used to get over it, if it was something harmful. And then it would obviously always end with how positive the Christian Science experience is, and then they'd sit back down. And so I was recording their testimonials, and I was going to kind of dissect them and see how they were structured and stuff like that. Boring parts. But anyway, I found that a lot of these testimonials would connect to a Christian Science teaching that they would then explain. So, they would say, oh, I had a headache, but then I thought about this, and then they would sit and explain the teaching a bit, and then they would kind of go on. And I did this whole report, and I explained how this was this element of it. But I had to wonder whether that explanation was there because I was in the room. Because they saw it as an opportunity of, they can't just say, yeah, this teaching, and then move on, because they might think that I don't know what that teaching is.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
they
yeah,
have
yeah.
to sit and explain it. But then that explanation became part of my analysis. But I had to kind of go, well, I don't know whether they would have sat and explained it if I wasn't in the room. But the fact that they took the time to explain it is also interesting. And so it's
Yes, yeah,
still
yeah, yeah.
data.
Yeah, absolutely. When I went down to East Grinstead, which is where you'll find the Saint Hill Manor, which is a lovely old manor that L. Ron Hubbard used to live in, that he'd bought in the 1960s, I think. That is where the British headquarters for the Church of Scientology is right now. And I had a really lovely moment, and where my tour guide, because there is a tour guide in the manor, because the manor is publicly open. You can go and visit the Saint Hill Manor, and you'll be given a tour of it. And I was shown around, and my tour guide, because I'm a researcher, said to me, "Oh, we'll give you the Scientologist tour today." So they took me to rooms that they didn't take everyday tourists, say, and they showed me the room where L. Ron Hubbard wrote some of his advanced writings on Scientology, for example, that they normally only showed to Church of Scientology members. And that was really nice because that was really valuable to see.
Yeah.
And it was a level of access that you don't get as somebody who pays to visit the manor. And to have that tour guide. So, they were keen to teach me. And I got a lot out of it in that sense, which was really nice. So if the tour guide's happening to be listening to this, thank you very much, because that was really insightful. But yeah, absolutely. There are ethical concerns. And this is what I always come back to with the Prime Directive in Star Trek, is you are always violating it if you are just making yourself known. In that, this episode aside, when there's other episodes where they visit a society, they somehow get involved, but then take a step back and say, "Oh, we can't, the Prime Directive." No, you're already there. You have already violated the Prime Directive simply by being present in this event. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because your very presence affects the way people behave around you. You have already influenced the trajectory of how this is going to go simply by being there. But then, when they're then taking the Prime Directive to the extreme, like in this episode, and hiding themselves, I mean, the show justifies it from a storytelling point of view. The show justifies it well. You think, oh yes, of course, because otherwise these people will see them and it'll affect their trajectory, because their cultural trajectory, because they'll try and work towards building their own spaceships because they've seen the Federation do it. But then I guess the big point there is then just leave them alone.
Yeah, then just don't.
Yeah. Because have you seen First Contact, the Next Gen film?
No.
When you finish watching Next Gen, you should watch the films. And the second Next Gen film is First Contact, and it's all about when the Vulcans first made contact with Earth. There's some time travel involved. What's it known as in Doctor Who? Wibbly wobbly, timey wimey stuff. And they end up back in the time of First Contact. And First Contact is made because this one guy manages to build a little shuttle that he launches into space. And then they make contact because it's inevitable then that he's going to bump into other species. I get it from that perspective, but it's... I mean... I always joke that we have a Prime Directive in our research, in that, because another aspect of the study of religions that's very important is that, particularly the non-theological study of religion, is that we don't get involved in theological / metaphysical debates.
Yes.
It doesn't matter to us whether we agree with the beliefs of the group that we're studying. That's irrelevant. We are simply studying what they believe and what they do, more importantly.
Yeah, I got into so I used to teach first years at Durham, and one of the kind of fun moments every year was trying to teach them the difference between theology and study of religion, which is very nuanced and complicated, but the biggest one comes down to the fact that we just don't care if they are right. That's not the point. It doesn't matter. And I got into an argument with well, it wasn't really me getting into the argument, but there's always huffy students who get upset at the idea that I am saying that God existing doesn't matter. And they get very upset with me. And I had one student in particular that said, "Oh, so we can only do study of religion if we're atheists." And I said, "Well, isn't an atheistic stance a theological stance?" And you could see that she instantly had to go, "Oh shit," and back down, because it was like, that's still a viewpoint, that's still a stance. If I'm to say that God doesn't exist, that's a stance, and my point is that it doesn't matter. And that doesn't impact my research. When I was doing my undergrad, I had a lecturer tell me that if through the course he could tell what religion I am, I've done it wrong. And that to
Yeah.
me was the best way of kind of explaining it.
Yeah, absolutely. So we do have a prime directive in that sense, in that if we are doing fieldwork and somebody explains their belief, we won't challenge them on that.
No.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, there's a lot to unpack here, and Star Trek in general is very interesting for its presentation of religion. You mentioned Worf just now, and all the aspects of Klingon culture. Every now and then they'll bring out the onboard anthropologist, or the onboards. I remember there's an episode in the first season where in the original series of Star Trek where Kirk and Spock beam down to a planet with the onboard sociologist, and I think, damn, I'd love that job. That would.
They made a comment about how they were anthropologists, and Tom, my husband, just went, I mean, they're not really anthropologists then if they're not studying, like, humans, right?
Yeah.
And I was like, good point.
Yeah. Humanoids, I think the term they uses. But yeah, there's a lot to unpack with Star Trek. The questions of what if this was actually real, what would you be doing?
Yeah. And I think there's, I think also embedded in Star Trek, and you kind of hinted at it when you were talking about their kind of view of an egalitarian society, is I find it's clearly written from people who have never done anthropology or studied things in that kind of great detail, not because of, issues like this, but also because of stances of not quite understanding institutionalized prejudices, what it means to have institutionalized racism, what it means to have institutionalized sexism, institutionalized homophobia, that they kind of say, oh yeah, everything's the same as we understand the institutions to be, there's just, we just don't have racism. And it's like, well, it's not really how this works. Like, you have to completely upend some of these systems and alter them in order to not have racism. And, I think we saw our very first black admiral in a recent episode that me and my husband watched, and we're about halfway through season 3. And there's been a lot of admirals, and they are always old white men.
Yeah.
Every time. And of course the black one was a black man, so there's still like no female, no.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like there's a lot of good intentions. And
yes, I think it's from the late 80s, early 90s. So, and written by, I'm assuming, white people. So I don't think there's a lot of knowledge yet about those things, and that, it wasn't until pretty much last year that a lot of white people learned about institutionalized racism.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So, to expect that in the 90s might be asking a lot, but it makes it very clear that there are these lack of understandings of how society works.
So the way it's positioned in the Star Trek universe is that it's the advent of technology, particularly space technology, that has led to this equal society. So in the Star Trek lore, there was a Third World War. I apologise for the ice cream van behind me. I'm going to resist going for an ice cream.
I was about to say, you're going to send your wife out to go get you some ice cream.
I don't think they do vegan ice cream, I'm afraid. But, right, there it goes. Yes, so there's a Third World War in the Star Trek universe where Earth essentially obliterates itself with nuclear weapons, and they rebuild themselves from there. And it's through the advent of technology, particularly the tech they have in food dispensers, in that they can simply create food. Then this solves the issue of poverty. It is all very convenient. And then education comes to the forefront of society, and there is also that then critique of capitalism, in that they move beyond neoliberal capitalistic models of society where people learn to be better for the sake of it. So there's an episode of Next Gen. I don't know if you've seen this one yet. Saying this won't be too spoilery for you. They essentially defrost some people.
I have seen this one.
Yeah, right. Okay. Yeah. So they defrost some people who were. There was some sort of 1990s fad where very wealthy people were cryogenically freezing themselves so that they could be thawed and cured of their diseases at a future time. And they defrost these people, and they're three very different individuals, and one of them is the capitalist, the man, so to speak. And as soon as he's defrosted, I know I'm using a very loose term here. As soon as he's awoken, he wants to speak to his lawyer, who's presumably been dead for hundreds of years, and he wants to access his accounts. And money is everything to him, and his brain is melted by Picard saying to him, "You don't have money. We're not driven by money." And he says to him, "Well, what's the point?" And Picard says, "Well, the point is to grow. It's to learn. It's to better yourself. Enjoy it." And this is the aspect of Star Trek I really love, is that emphasis on becoming a better person.
Yeah.
That I really enjoy what they do there. So that everyone who has a job on the Enterprise is doing it because they want to be better people, because they are on this voyage to learn.
And I think Picard is actually a really good kind of character for that, because they portray him as this kind of Renaissance man who is knowledgeable in so many things, so he can quote Shakespeare but also knows about engineering. And
yes, and he's also not a soldier. This is what I really love about the Enterprise, is that they are on a journey to learn. It is literally to discover new worlds and new civilizations, to quote the opening segment. It isn't a Star Wars, it's a Star Trek. So, I like that they are on a voyage of education, and as somebody who just loves to learn about things and learn about societies, it really does resonate with me. That doesn't take away from some of the problematic aspects that we've discussed today, of course, but the core thesis of Star Trek is something that I really do love. And I love Next Gen for it, because again, Picard isn't a soldier. He's somebody who wants to learn. He's on a voyage to learn.
Yeah.
And I really like that. So before we do wrap up, Vivian, I have to ask you, Kirk or Picard?
Well, I have not really watched much of the original season, or series. We watched, I think 2 or 3 episodes, and I was more kind of wanting to at least keep trying. My husband was not feeling it. So we took a little bit of a Star Trek break, and then you, as well as many other people, told me to start with Next Gen rather than starting with the original series. So Picard so far is my favorite, but I don't have anything as much to compare it to, because I only watched about 2 episodes with Kirk. But I do have a soft spot for Patrick Stewart, just in general.
Well, yes.
And I think I've always known he was an amazing actor, but watching Star Trek has really driven it home for me that he can have a face and not move anything on his face, and suddenly there's a completely different emotion.
Yeah.
There.
Oh, he's incredible. He is.
And he gives just the best, just looks.
Yeah.
There was an episode we watched just a day or 2 ago now, and I can't remember which one it was, but he had the best just angry look on his face that made me go, oh shit. And I turned to my husband and I go, does Patrick Stewart have any kids? And he was like, oh, I don't know. And I was like, because if he has kids, I know that look. That is an angry dad look from someone who doesn't shout.
Yeah, you've let him down.
Because my dad has that, where he doesn't shout at you, but he'll give you a look and then he'll talk real quiet and you go,
yeah.
And Patrick Stewart had that look, and my immediate reaction was to go, "I'm so sorry."
Yeah. Yeah, he is absolutely incredible, and there are some very moving moments in the show as well that he delivers really well.
Yeah.
Um, if you told me a few years ago I'd be saying this, I wouldn't believe you. I think I prefer Picard, and Kirk's my man. I love me some Captain Kirk, but I think Picard is the model Starfleet officer, and that stuff matters to me. I really like it when they follow Starfleet protocol. Um, so yeah, that's he is very much the anchor of the show. And if any of our listeners haven't actually watched Star Trek: The Next Generation, I really recommend that you do. It's a great time.
If anyone was like me and trying to start from the beginning, I've had a much easier time getting into Star Trek through Next Gen than I did starting from the beginning of the original series. So
Season 2 of the original series is the best. They got their budget cut in season 3, and season 3 has a lot of dodgy episodes. Season 1 I do really love as well, but season 2 is when it was really at its best. But there's a couple of episodes in season 3, like there's an episode, I'm sorry, I'm going to bore the listeners just for a moment, but I have to get it off my chest. There's an episode where Spock loses his brain, and oh my gosh, it's terrible. McCoy kind of hooks Spock up to some remote control thing, and he's controlling Spock's body, and they go down to the planet to try and retrieve his brain. And I think that's all you need to know. It's really bad. So that was the depths of season 3. But there's still some highs.
I think the listeners have gotten a very good understanding of why sometimes our meetings together, when it's just me and you, take about 4 hours, because
we've got to unpack these
we
things.
Start talking about Star Trek because you ask me about where I'm at.
Yeah. Well, knowing that you're, still in season 3, I know you've got some really big stuff coming up that I'm really excited to discuss. So that'll be fun.
Well, maybe we'll do something like this again, where we'll kind of pick apart a specific episode as I kind of go through it. And we can do this with other shows as well. So if anyone's got any ideas of things that you want us to unpack, let us know.
Yes, that would be absolutely brilliant. And if they need to tell you, Vivian, where can they find you?
Well, they can find me on Twitter. I'm at Vivian Asimos. I'm at Vivian Asimos on a lot of social media, so you can just, I don't know, put it in the search and see if I pop up. And you can also go to my website, incidentalmythology.com.
Absolutely. And do you have any books on sale there that people can buy?
I do. How did you know?
I get a sense.
So I've got 2 books that have recently come out. I've got one of them that is highly financially accessible, and the other one is not. But if you are interested in the academic one, which is the one that is not accessible, you can always get your library to buy it for you. You can do this through public libraries as well as through uni libraries by requesting them to purchase it. And then there is a purchase on the docket and you get to read it for free. So that's what I would suggest.
Yes, I completely agree. And you can do the same thing with my book, which is also quite expensive. And if you want to know where to find that book, come and ask me on Twitter at AledJLL Thomas. We can talk about Star Trek. We can talk about politics. We can talk about religion. We can talk about whatever you like. If you just want to have a good old chinwag, I'm there. So thank you very much for joining me, Vivian. It's been a delight to talk about Star Trek, as usual. I love Star Trek, in case you can't tell. Oh, I think I may watch some Star Trek tonight. Particularly Next Gen. I'm just in the mood for it. And thank you, listeners, for joining us. We shall see you next time for more religion and popular culture and everything in between. Bye-bye.
Bye.